Hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. And this lecture is all about KMS grants. And KMS grants have definitely been coming up in the exams recently based on student feedback. So this lecture is going to tell you everything that you need to know for the exam. So let's get started. So what are KMS grants? Well, grants are an alternative access control mechanism to using key policies, and they allow you to programmatically delegate the use of your KMS customer master keys to other AWS principals. For example, a user either in your own account or in another AWS account. And grants are generally used to provide temporary granular permissions. So think encrypt, decrypt, re-encrypt, describe key, and that's just a few of them. They only allow you to define access, so you cannot explicitly deny access using a grant. And once again, they are generally used for temporary permissions. So definitely use key policies for relatively static permissions. And if you need to define an explicit deny, you can't use a grant. So in that case, you would need to use a key policy. And the way that I try to remember it is, imagine you go out of town on a work trip and you give me the keys to your house so that I can come and feed the cat and water the plants. But then at the end of the week, you're going to come home and you're going to ask me to give you back your keys, because this is only going to be a temporary arrangement. You don't want me to keep the keys of your house as an ongoing arrangement. So when you come back, you're going to ask me to return the keys and I will no longer have access to your house. Grants are configured programmatically using the AWS CLI. And there are three main commands that you need to know about. So firstly, there is create grant, and that adds a new grant to the CMK, specifies who can use it, and also provides a list of operations that the user or the grantee can perform. We also have list grants, and you can use this command to list all the grants that have been configured for your CMK. And then finally, there is revoke grant, and that is the command that you use if you want to remove or revoke a grant. And when you create a grant token is generated, and that can be passed as an argument to your KMS API. But the best way to learn about KMS grants is really to start playing around with it yourself. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So we're going to create a new CMK, create a new user, and then have a play around with grants. And we can actually do everything in the command line. So I've prepared all of the commands in a text file, so you can just copy and paste them into your terminal window. So first of all, I'm going to talk you through the commands that we're going to be running. So first of all, we're going to create a new key and we're going to make a note of the region that we're working in, because of course KMS is regional and you can only use the keys in the same region that the key was created. We're then going to test encrypting plain text using the new key and check that it works correctly. We're going to create a brand new user called Dave and generate access key and secret access key for him. We're then going to run AWS configure using Dave's secret access key and his access key, and we're going to create a CLI profile for him, and that's going to allow us to run AWS commands using his profile and his credentials. We're then going to test if Dave can successfully run the KMS encrypt command. He shouldn't be able to, because at this stage he's not going to have any permissions to run the command. We're then going to configure the KMS grant. So we'll run the create grant command. And once the grant is in place, we should then be able to successfully run KMS encrypt using Dave's profile. And then the final two steps we're going to do is to revoke the grant, and then we're going to check that the revoke was successful. So let's begin and copy the first command and paste it into our terminal. So that has created our key. And the first thing I'm going to do is just make a note of the ARN for our key, because we'll need to use this in some of the subsequent commands. And just notice the region that you have created your key. So mine is in US East 1, so that is the default region for my CLI. So I'm just going to come back to my notepad and I'm just going to make a note of that ARN. So the next thing we need to do is test that we can actually use this key. So I'm going to replace the ARN there in that command and then just copy and paste the whole thing into my terminal window. Okay, so that has been successful, and that is our encrypted text here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our user called Dave. So I'm just going to copy that and paste that into our terminal. So that has created our user, and I'm going to copy his ARN as well, because we're going to be using that later as well. And then in the next command, we're going to create his access key and secret access key. And then we're going to run AWS configure -- profile Dave. And it's going to ask us for the access key and secret access key. So just grab the access key from the command above, and same again for the secret access key. and set the default region so that it matches the region where you created your CMK in the previous step. So for me, that is US East 1. And then in the next command, we're going to test Dave's account and see if he is able to run KMS encrypt. So I'm just going to grab our key ID and add it into the command there. Remove that second bracket and then copy and paste that into our window. So there we are, we've had an error and it's an access denied exception. When calling the encrypt operation, our user is not authorized to perform KMS encrypt on this resource. So let's set up the grant for this user and see if we can grant him access to run the encrypt command. So there's a couple of things that we need to add into this command. First of all, we need to add in the key ID. And then the second thing we need to add is the grantee principal. So that's going to be Dave's ARN. And if you didn't make a note of Dave's ARN, you can just find it by running this command, AWS IAM get user -- username Dave. But I've saved it down here, so I'm just going to grab it and paste it there. And then copy the entire command, clear my screen, and then paste. So this command is the one that's actually going to create the grant, and we've provided as arguments the ARN of the key, the ARN of the user, and then right at the end of the command we define which operations the user is going to have access to, and in this case it's just going to be encrypt. So if that command has been successful, the output that you get should be this grant token and a grant ID as well. And it's this grant token that Dave can supply as an argument to the encrypt command. And if we set this up correctly, he should now be able to access that CMK and run the encrypt command. So let's come back to our commands. And the first thing we need to do is provide the key ID. And we also need to supply the grant token as well. Just to make this easier, I'm just going to copy the whole command. And then I'm going to grab my grant token and then just modify it at the command line. Okay, so I've added my token into the command and hit enter. And here is our encrypted text. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try the list grants command and the revoke grant command as well. And this command just lists any grants associated with our key ID. And the main thing we're interested in here is this grant ID, because we need this grant ID when we go ahead and revoke the grant. So let's come back to the next command, copy the command, and then the last thing that we need to add is the grant ID and hit enter. And now we can test if the revoke has been successful. So I'm just going to hit up arrow until I get back to the encrypt command. And we're going to try and run that again. And you should see the same error that we saw at the beginning, the access denied exception. So our user is not authorized to perform KMS encrypt on the resource. And if we hit up arrow again and go back to our list grants command, there are no grants now associated with our CMK. So that is KMS grants. So let's take a look at some of our exam tips. Just remember, a grant is used to programmatically delegate the use of your CMK to a user either in your own account or in another account, and it provides temporary and granular permissions. Use create grant to add a grant and define the operations that the grantee or the user can perform. And remember, you can use key policies mainly for relatively static permissions or if you want to define an explicit deny, whereas grants are mainly for temporary use of the CMK, and you cannot define a deny, you can only define an allow using a grant. So that is everything you should need to know about KMS grants. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.